Hi my friends, today I'm going to show you how I made these trousers. These are super beginner friendly, there is no zipper, no serger needed. So if you're interested, head over to my Etsy, get hold of the pattern and let's get started. Start by printing out the pattern at 100% scale. To make sure this is done correctly, measure the box on the first page to be exactly 10 by 10 centimeters. Then just lay out the sheets of paper one after each other according to the printing layout, tape them together and make sure they're not overlapping. It's okay that the lines doesn't go all the way to the edge. Then just cut out your pattern. I highly recommend you make a mock-up before you cut into your nice fabric. This pattern is based on standardized sizes which our bodies rarely fit into, so make a mock-up and adjust the pattern accordingly. I plan on making a separate video on how to adjust the pattern, so if you guys are interested in that, let me know in the comments down below. I'm quite happy with how this mock-up turned out, so I'm just making a few more adjustments and then I'm ready to start on my nice fabric, which is folded in half, and then I just lay my pattern pieces on top, making sure the grain line is parallel to the selvage edge. This is especially important with these wide-legged trousers. Then just cut out all of your pattern pieces and cut into the notches as well. Make sure you don't cut in too deep. When all the pattern pieces are cut up, we're going to start by sewing together the center back. I'm using a French seam for this, so with wrong sides facing each other, I'm going to sew along this line with 7.5mm seam allowance. Then I'm going to press the seam flat to relax the thread, and then I'm going to press the seam open. When I've done that, I'm going to turn the project so that the right sides are facing each other, making sure to get the seam all the way to the edge and then pressing it flat. Then we're just going to open it up again and trim away the excess seam allowance, so about half of the seam allowance. I prefer to use pinking shears for this, but you can definitely use normal fabric scissors if you want to do that instead. Give it one final good press before you sew again with the same seam allowance along here, so that's 7.5mm seam allowance. Press the seam flat to relax the threads. Open it up, wrong sides facing you, and press it towards your right. Now you're just going to do the exact same thing with the center front, and then once you've done that, you're going to place it on top of your back piece, wrong sides together, the inside seam is next. So to make the seam align, we're going to be careful when placing our needles. So just make sure that you put the needle exactly on your seam, and that will make sure that the seams align nicely. Then needle together the rest of the inside seam. So again, that's wrong sides facing each other, because we're going to make a French seam on the inside seam as well. Now you're going to sew along here with 7.5mm seam allowance. I prefer to start in the middle and then work my way down each leg to make sure that the seams line up perfectly. Then you're just going to do the exact same process as earlier to make a French seam. So press it open, cut away the excess, and then make sure you're careful with the matching of the seams and press the front seam towards the back of the trousers. Now we're ready to sew the right side seam, so with right sides facing each other, sew until about 1 centimeter below the final notch or wherever you want your split to be. And again, that's the right sides facing each other because we're not using a French seam here, and then it also means that we're using 1.5 centimeter seam allowance. Make sure that you are going back and forth quite a few times wherever you end your sewing line, just to make sure that the split will be nice and strong. Then press the seam flat and open it up and press the seam open. To finish off the right side of your trousers, what I like to do is mark double the amount of the seam allowance. So for this pattern, that's 3 centimeters, and I just mark 3 centimeters all the way up to the split on both sides. Then I fold the fabric so that the edge of the fabric meets where we drew the line, and I press that with an iron. Now we're going to repeat the process once again, but this time the edge of the fabric is meeting where we just created crease line with iron, so that means that the fabric now gets folded twice. We are going to do the same thing where we sew the side seam, so just tuck in that seam allowance meeting where the seam is at. Now we're just going to secure that down, so that means you should have a seam allowance of about 6 millimeters, 5 something. That makes sure you catch the fold underneath, but just barely, and you do that all the way to the top as you see here. Then just give it a good press, and you do the same thing on both sides of the split, and you're done with the right side. For the next part of the project, we're going to need bias tape, so I'm just going to show you how to make it in case you don't have any like me. So here I just have a big rectangle fabric. I cut away the corner at the bias, so that's 45 degrees from the selvage edge, and I'm just going to mark 3 centimeters all the way across until I reach the end. Then I'm going to trim away the excess fabric and mark my seam allowance. So I'm marking 1.5 centimeters away from the edges. Now we're just going to needle the long sides together. So we want the corner to go one up so that we have a loose end, and then on the crosses where the seam allowance and the bias measurements meet, we're going to needle it together like I'm showing you here. When you're all done, it's going to be looking a little bit wonky, but that's fine. Just sew along the seam line all the way to the edge. Once you press the seam open, it's going to look like this. Then you can just start to cut all the way where you marked your bias line. And there you have it, how to make bias binding. And this made plenty for the project. Now just needle together the bias binding and the top edge of the trouser together. And unfortunately I forgot to record it, but I have ironed on some interfacing on the bias tape to make the top of the trouser a little bit more stable. And now we're just going to sew along the top edge with 1.5 centimeter seam allowance. Again, we're just going to press it flat to relax the threads and then press the bias tip towards the top. So from the front side, pressing it towards the top. And then we're going to top stitch along the top edge here to make sure that the trousers stay crisp and clean. So I'm just sewing 1 or 2 millimeters away from the edge on the seam allowance and the bias tape. Here you can see the finished under stitching, and then from the wrong side I'm just going to trim away some excess seam allowance. Now we're going to press our bias tape in half towards the wrong side of our project. Then we are just folding it over once again, and we can top stitch it down just like we did on the side of our trouser. Again, just top stitch along this line, making sure to grab the bias binding underneath. I do prefer to do all my top stitching from the right side, even though I know it can be a little bit tricky to make sure that you're catching the seam allowance underneath, but I do still prefer to do it from the top, just to make sure that the seam is not wonky and parallel to the top edge. Now for the ties, fold it in half and then sew along the long edge. Remember, here you only have 1 centimeter seam allowance. I'm working with quite thick fabric, so I'm choosing to trim away a little bit of the seam allowance. You don't have to if you're working with a thinner fabric. Then just grab your safety pin and turn the strap inside out. Now for the left side of the trouser. Here, instead of placing the interfacing on the bias tape, we're going to place it on the side of the trouser itself, so that is all the way from the top to the last notch, and then just 2 centimeters below the last notch. And the interfacing is just a strip of fabric that's 2 centimeters wide. I have 3 centimeters there. That's a mistake. Don't do what I did. It should be 2 centimeters wide. Now we're going to fasten the bias tape on the side of the trouser, just like we did with the top part of the trouser, but first we need to place our ties. So here I'm just placing the top tie just on the edge of the top of the trouser, and then I'm folding my bias tape a little bit on the top and placing that over the tie, so the tie sandwich between the bias tape and the trouser. Then just continue needling downwards until you meet your notch, and then just place the tie directly underneath the notch. Continue doing that until you've done all your notches. So that's altogether 4 or 5 ties from the top, depending on which size you're sewing, and it should look something like this, so that the bias tape is all the way down to the bottom of the leg. Even though there's no ties there, we're just going to finish it, as I said, like we did with the top part of the trouser. So that's sewing it with 1.5 centimeter seam allowance, and then once you've done that, you can press it and then do the understitching like I'm doing here. Just be careful not to accidentally sew over the long ends of your ties. then it's just the same procedure of trimming down the excess seam allowance and then ironing it all down, folding the edge twice over so that all the raw edges are hidden inside the seam. And once you've done that, you can go ahead and top stitch and do the same thing on the other side. You could also finish off the top stitching by hand if you wanted it to be more invisible, like I'm doing here to finish off the ties. Here I'm using a slip stitch, but to finish off the side of the trousers or the top of the trousers, then you would use something like a dot stitch or an invisible hem stitch. Now the last thing we need to do is to hem the trousers. So I like to just mark 8 centimeters up because we have a 4 centimeter hem allowance. That way it makes it easier when we're going to press the hem later. So I mark 8 centimeters and 2 centimeters. So that leaves me with a hem that's 3 centimeters wide. And I'm sorry guys, I seem to not have recorded me pressing the hem, but yeah, you press it so that edge meets the 8 centimeter marking and then press it so the edge meets the 2 centimeter marking. That way you have a 3 centimeter wide hem, and then yeah, just top stitch it like I'm doing here. Give it a final press and you're all done. Thank you so much for watching, and if you decide to make these trousers, please tag me. I would love to see what you created. And if you have any questions, please let me know in the comments down below. Again, thank you so much for watching. See you soon. Bye!